How do you bring about innovative research into mainstream water pricing and reform? And could you also cite successful examples of where optimal water pricing has actually led to better utilization of water as a resource?
Certainly. I mean, water pricing, good water pricing is really fundamental to providing incentives for water users, whether it's households or agriculture farmers or businesses, to actually use the resource well, to use it sensibly, to use it efficiently. So this is a real challenge, putting in place the right water prices. Now, one of the most fundamental things that you need to be able to do that is to have water meters, to actually measure the amount of water that's being used. Now, this seems straightforward, but in fact it's a real challenge. In a lot of countries, including OECD countries, we're not yet charging households for the amount of water they use. They're being charged, for example, based on whether they have a house, or how big the house is, or the apartment is, or how many people are there, rather than how much they use. And if that's the case, there's no incentive to reduce their water use. So what we've seen is that metering, better metering of water, and then charging based on the amount that's used. We looked across households, 10,000 households in 10 different countries, and we found that on average would reduce water use by 20% per household compared to without that. So it's a sort of fundamental area, putting that in place. And with agriculture, of course, that's particularly important. Many countries don't charge at all for agricultural water use. Agriculture uses currently 70% of water, and going forward, if we want to feed the world's population, in particular a population that's growing, many of whom are hungry now, the challenge of feeding the world, we're going to need to make sure water use is much more efficient in agriculture. So metering, using technologies like drip irrigation schemes. There's no incentive for farmers to put this in place now if they're not charged for water. But if you start to charge for water, you start to see some incentives. You mentioned the question of good examples and case studies. One of the things that we've seen in OECD countries is that since 1990, almost, well, in fact it's more than a third, between a third and a quarter of all OECD countries have actually reduced their total water use. Not just their water use per person or per GDP, but their total water use. So they've had a full decoupling of water use, water consumption, and economic growth. So this is quite significant. And for most of these countries, I think one of the major driving factors was good water pricing. They're not yet there. Some countries, for example, Denmark is probably one with some of the highest water prices. They have very good internalization of water prices, but there's still been major successes there in the other countries. We've also seen in a number of emerging economies where they've started to put better water pricing in place, it ends up being a virtuous circle between the sort of economics, the environment, and the social aspects. A major challenge is making sure that people have access to water supply and sanitation. And of course, if one of the things we found is that by using water pricing, some of the revenues of the water prices can be used to invest into better water supply and sanitation systems, to make sure that you can actually have the money and the finances, to have the pipes, to have the water treatment plants, so that you can deliver clean, affordable water to everyone.
Okay. So, based on the fact that the drip irrigation system and stuff that you've mentioned, about implementing water pricing, all of this is seen in the case of OECD countries. What about developing countries like India, China, where maybe increasing or maybe having a higher water price will bring about an astounding fall in the number of consumers, who would probably want to go for it. They might just go for alternative substitutes. So how do you bring about, a reconciliation between demand and supply here?
Absolutely, and what you see in a number of developing countries in particular is that people have not put in place water pricing, for example, for household water use, because there's a real fear that this would be unaffordable for low-income households. So there's a real challenge to address this. Now, one of the things I think it's important to do is compare the situation of putting in place a small water price or a small price on water with what happens without that. In some countries in Africa, what you have is there's wells, but they're very far away from the local village, which means women and children often are the ones who have to walk for long distances. They're missing out on schooling and they're missing out on work in order to get water. Another alternative is you're able to access water, but it's not very clean, right? And then what happens? You're sick, again, when you're sick, the low-income people, no access to schools and not able to go to their jobs because they're ill. And then the third option is to buy water from private vendors. And you see this in a lot of countries, Mexico and other countries, where many people buy big water bottles from local vendors, and that's much, much more expensive than it would have been if you'd actually had a proper water supply and sanitation system with clean water going to the households. So it is a challenge. I think one of the things we need to do is really compare the scenario of having water pricing with what the alternatives are in the local situation. And I think the other thing you need to do is, instead of doing across-the-board subsidies for all water users, to make sure that what funding there is available for subsidies used to target the low-income households. Because you don't need to subsidize water use for the rich who are watering their gardens, who have huge houses, and maybe a swimming pool. They don't need subsidies for their water use. But you do want to make sure that you're targeting those low-income households that really need it. Again, I think one of the things that we need to be clear about is what the alternative is. So if we were able to show to local communities how much money they would each be paying if there was to be a water supply and sanitation system through the pipes or whatever system there would be, where they were paying for water, clean water, through a sort of publicly organized system, how much that would cost. And then if we're able to compare with how much they spent last year on medical bills because they were sick, on time out of school and out of work because they weren't able to do that. If you could actually show these to people side by side, these numbers, I wonder if they would make different choices, and if they would push for having a system where they had to pay water prices, but those water prices are lower than the costs of not paying water prices. That women have often not had the opportunity to participate, and I think do bring a different perspective. So how we actually try and move that forward in the clean energy field is, it's a challenge. Certainly energy and engineering have been areas which I think have been very male dominated in the past, and you still see that often at the top levels. I think one of the major opportunities that we have for change is that when you go to universities, what you're starting to see is many more women going into these courses and into these specialized, much more technical courses than we've seen in the past. And you're seeing this in a lot of different countries. So I think that's an opportunity, because these will be the leaders of the future. So you've got women going into those areas. I think it's also a question of women supporting each other and working together to encourage each other. These jobs at the top, the leadership jobs, are often very difficult ones and are often very lonely, and people can be very critical, sometimes quite unfairly, so you need support. And one thing I participated in a couple of years ago, which was very interesting, there's a clean energy ministerial, which is held every year, and I think it was 2 years ago, it was held in Abu Dhabi. And there the UAE government pulled together an event which was specifically about women leaders in energy. And you had women from South Africa, from Australia, from the UAE, who were at the tops of their field in energy and engineering. And it's very interesting to have them together in a panel, and to have a number of people, primarily women, but not only women, and even young girls actually, in the audience, listening to them about their experiences, what had worked, what hadn't, and where they saw the future. So I think even just hearing the stories of those who have succeeded, and understanding the steps that they went through, and sometimes hardships, but also a lot of rewards, can be very inspiring.